Hey there, and welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah.
Have you ever wondered how the government figures out how much to pay when they want to acquire land, for public use?
Oh, yeah, that's a really important question.
It
It
is.
goes right to the heart of property rights.
Yeah, for sure.
And today we're going to explore it through a fascinating case.
Yeah,
A Supreme Court case right here in the Philippines. Land Bank versus Del Rosario.
that's a great case to unpack, I think.
Yeah.
It really shows the tension between the needs of the government for land, for things like agrarian reform,
Right?
and the rights of individual landowners.
Exactly. And we're talking about a real story here.
Yeah,
This took place in Ligao City, Albay.
okay,
Two sisters, Aurora and Irene Del Rosario,
okay.
owned a 39-hectare coconut farm.
Wow, that's a lot of land.
Yeah, that's a serious amount of land.
Yeah.
And in 2001, their land was targeted for agrarian reform.
Which basically means the government wanted to redistribute that land to farmers who didn't have any land.
Ye-
So it's a big part of social justice and economic development.
Yeah.
But it also raises some really complex legal questions.
Oh, absolutely.
Like, how do you put a price tag on land that's been in a family for who knows how long?
Right.
Land that might even have sentimental value beyond its market price.
It's tricky, right? And that's where things get interesting.
Okay.
The Land Bank of the Philippines, representing the government, offered the sisters an initial amount of PHP 1,172,369.21.
I'm guessing they didn't quite jump at that offer.
You guessed right. They felt it was way too low.
Yeah.
And they weren't alone in thinking that.
Okay.
The Provincial Agrarian Reform Adjudicator, also known as PARAD,
Okay.
stepped in and reviewed the case,
Okay.
and PARAD decided that a much higher amount was fair.
Okay.
PHP 6,766,000 to be exact.
Wow, that's a huge gap.
Yeah, talk about a difference of opinion. So what happened next?
Yeah, what did happen next?
Well, as you can imagine, the Land Bank wasn't too thrilled with PARAD's decision.
Okay.
So they decided to appeal the case to the regional trial court.
Arguing that they had followed the proper formula for valuation.
So we're starting to see the legal gears turning.
Yes.
Did the regional trial court side with the Land Bank or the Del Rosario sisters?
It wasn't a clear victory for either side.
Okay.
The RTC partially agreed with the sisters.
Okay.
They increased the compensation to VHP 3,829,514.29,
Okay.
but they also ruled that the sisters were entitled to 12% interest per year on the unpaid balance going all the way back to 2001.
So it's kind of a mixed bag then.
Yes.
Like a higher compensation than the Land Bank initially offered.
Right.
But still less than PARAD thought was fair.
Yeah,
And that 12% interest could add up to a significant amount over time.
definitely.
But I have a feeling this isn't the end of the story, is it?
You're right on the money. The land bank, still not satisfied, decided to take the case up another notch,
Uh-oh.
appealing it to the Court of Appeals.
The stakes are getting higher.
They are.
And I imagine the legal arguments are getting even more complex. Absolutely. At this stage, there were 3 key points of contention that the Court of Appeals had to grapple with.
Okay, so let's break those down because I think understanding these points of contention will help us understand this case.
Yeah, definitely.
What was the first issue?
The first issue was about something called a legal easement.
Okay.
Basically, there was a portion of the Del Rosario sisters' land that was subject to a legal easement,
Okay.
which means someone else had the right to use that part of the property for a specific purpose.
So it's not land that they could fully utilize themselves.
Right.
So does that mean it shouldn't be included in the compensation?
That's precisely what the Land Bank argued,
Okay.
and it became a point of debate.
Okay, makes sense.
The second issue focused on the time of taking.
Okay.
In other words, what year should be used to determine the land's value for compensation purposes?
Right, because land values can change so much over time.
Exactly. And this is crucial because it wouldn't be fair to the sisters if the compensation was based on the land's value years after it was taken.
Right, especially if the value had gone up.
Right.
But how do you determine the exact time of taking in a legal sense?
Well, that's where things get interesting. It's not always as straightforward as it seems.
Okay.
And to add another layer of complexity, there was a third issue
Okay.
related to the price of copra.
Right, because this was a coconut farm.
Exactly.
And copra, that's the dried coconut meat.
That's right.
And the price of that is a key factor in figuring out the income potential of a coconut farm.
Definitely.
So the question was, should the compensation be based on the average copra price over like a 6-year period,
Okay.
or just the copra price in 2001, the year the government started the process?
Right. So we have these 3 interconnected issues.
Yeah.
The legal easement, the time of taking, and the copra price.
And I bet the Court of Appeals had a hard time figuring this out.
They ended up modifying the RTC's decision,
Okay.
reducing the compensation to PHP 2,176,571.588. Okay. However, they upheld the 12% annual interest on the unpaid balance.
So we've gone from the land bank's initial offer of just over 1 million pesos
Right.
to the Court of Appeals settling on a little over 2 million.
Yeah,
This is quite the journey.
it is.
Clearly, this isn't the end of the road.
You're absolutely right. The land bank, still not satisfied, decided to appeal the case to the highest court in the land, the Supreme Court.
Oh, wow. So this is where it all comes to a head.
Yes.
The Supreme Court is the final say.
Yes.
They have to sort through all these issues,
Right.
weigh the arguments of both sides,
Yeah.
and come up with a decision on just compensation.
And their decision in Land Bank versus Del Rosario has implications that go far beyond just this one case.
Okay.
It sets a precedent for future land acquisitions,
Wow.
clarifying how these crucial issues should be approached.
This is where it gets really interesting.
And it does.
We're about to dive into the Supreme Court's decision
Yes.
and explore its significance.
Okay.
But first, let's take a quick break.
Sounds good.
When we come back, we'll unpack the Supreme Court's verdict in Land Bank versus Del Rosario G.R. Nome, 2105, decided on July 29th, 2019.
Okay.
Stay tuned. Welcome back. So we've made it to the Supreme Court, the final stage of this legal battle. I'm really curious to hear how they tackled those complex issues we talked about. You know, the legal easement, the time of taking, and the copra price.
Yeah, those are some tricky questions.
They were. What did the Supreme Court decide on the compensation for the Del Rosario sisters?
Okay, so after reviewing everything, the Supreme Court decided on a compensation amount of PHP 1,310,563.37.
Okay, so that's closer to the land bank's initial offer than the amount the PR decided on.
Right.
What was their reasoning? Did they agree with the land bank on all 3 points?
Well, to really understand their decision, we need to look at the legal principles that they focused on, and this is where things get really interesting, especially if you're into how the Philippine law looks at just compensation.
Right.
So the Supreme Court really zeroed in on this thing called the principle of just compensation.
That sounds pretty straightforward.
Yeah, it is.
What does it mean, like, in practice?
Basically, it means that when the government acquires private property for public use, the owner has to be compensated fairly for what they've lost.
Okay.
But figuring out what's fair is where it gets complicated.
Right.
The Supreme Court really emphasized that the compensation has to be based on what the land was worth at the time it was taken,
Okay.
not years later.
So that takes care of the time of taking issue we were talking about.
Exactly.
But how did they decide what the land was actually worth back in 2001?
Well, that's where this formula from DR Administrative Order Number 5 series of 1998 comes in.
Okay.
This order was in effect back in 2001.
Right.
And it lays out a formula for calculating just compensation, which is really key here.
A formula. Okay, so we're getting into the nitty-gritty now of how this works.
Yeah, we are.
What does this formula actually look at?
It's a pretty cool approach, actually.
Okay.
It considers both the capitalized net income of the property
Okay.
and its market value.
Capitalized net income. That sounds a little intimidating. Can you explain that? I bet our listeners are wondering about this too.
Sure. It's basically a way to estimate the current value of all the future income that land could generate.
Okay.
Like, think about it this way. If you owned a rental property, you wouldn't just think about its current market value.
Right.
You'd also think about how much rent you could make from it over time.
That makes sense.
So they're looking at the long-term income potential of the coconut farm,
Right.
not just what someone would pay for the land at a specific moment.
I got it.
So in this case, they looked at things like the average selling price of copra,
Okay.
the number of coconut trees on the land to estimate how much income the farm could make,
Okay.
and they even used the average copra price specifically from 2001.
Okay.
Because that was when the government started the process.
So that's how they settled the copra price issue.
Yes.
They stuck with that time of taking principle, even for the copra price.
Exactly. The Supreme Court said that using data from after the government took possession wouldn't be fair.
Okay.
And on the question of that legal easement, the Supreme Court agreed with the land bank that it should be deducted from the total area that they were compensating for.
Okay, so they sided with the land bank on that one.
Yeah.
That makes sense since the sisters couldn't fully use that part of the land anyway.
Right.
But what about the 12% interest that the regional trial court awarded? Did the Supreme Court agree with that?
They did, actually. But with a little twist, they ruled that the 12% rate would be applied from the time of taking back in 2001 until June 30th, 2013.
Okay.
And then after that, the interest rate would drop to 6%.
Oh, okay.
Which aligns with the new legal rate.
So even the interest rate can change over time.
It can.
It seems like the Supreme Court really took into account the fact that this whole case took place over a lot of years,
Yeah.
and legal things can change.
Yeah. Exactly. This case wasn't just about the numbers. It was about figuring out property rights, government power, and just compensation in a way that was fair and legal.
Right.
The court had to balance everyone's interests and make sure their decision matched up with the laws.
It sounds like they were really thorough.
They
Where
wanted.
it didn't just side with one side. They
Right.
looked at everything.
They did. And their decision provides really valuable insights for anyone interested in Philippine law.
Okay.
Especially when it comes to things like acquiring land and just compensation.
I can already see how this case could impact similar situations in the future.
Yeah, definitely.
But before we get into that, I want to make sure we've got all the pieces of the puzzle.
Okay.
We've covered a lot of ground from the beginning to the Supreme Court's decision. Okay, so we've gone through this whole case, Land Bank versus Del Rosario, and we've seen how the Supreme Court got to their decision. It's been quite a trip through the Philippine legal system. But now I'm thinking about the bigger picture. What does this case mean for other landowners, or even for how the government handles agrarian reform?
That's the big question, isn't it? Every case is different, but Land Bank versus Del Rosario gives us a really good framework for similar situations. It shows us this basic idea. Just compensation has to be based on the value at the time of taking, not later when things could be very different.
Right, that makes sense. It protects landowners from getting a bad deal if their land suddenly becomes more valuable after the government decides they want it.
Exactly. Imagine if the government could just take land and then pay based on what it's worth years later.
Yeah.
That wouldn't be fair.
Yeah.
This case makes it clear that the clock stops when the land is taken.
So that's a big takeaway for sure.
Yeah.
What about that formula they use, the one that combines like the capitalized net income and market value? Do you think we'll see that used in future cases?
It's hard to say for sure, but I think it's very possible. The Supreme Court didn't just use it. They explain why it works in detail. It sets a strong precedent, for other courts.
And what I find interesting about that formula is it doesn't just look at the price of the land right now. It also looks at its ability to make money in the future.
That's a really important point. It recognizes that land can be valuable beyond its market price, especially when it's being used for agriculture, like the coconut farm in this case.
This whole case makes me think about how important record keeping is too, both for landowners and the government. They need to be able to prove what the land was worth back then.
Oh, absolutely. Detailed records, accurate valuations, documentation of things like copra prices, all of that becomes really crucial evidence in these kinds of cases. Land Bank versus Del Rosario reminds us that you have to understand your rights and the laws, especially when it comes to property.
It makes me wonder if this case might lead to positive changes in how these land acquisitions happen in the future. Maybe more transparency and fairness.
That's a good thought. At the very least, it gives us some clarity and emphasizes that balance between what the government needs and the rights of landowners. And at the center of it all is that idea of just compensation, making sure nobody loses their property without being fairly compensated.
Very well said. It's been a deep dive into a complex but super important topic. I think our listeners have a much better understanding now of land acquisition and just compensation here in the Philippines, all thanks to this really interesting case, Land Bank versus Del Rosario.
It's been great exploring this with you.
And for our listeners, if you like this deep dive, we encourage you to check out some of our other episodes. We talk about a wide range of things, always trying to bring you the important stuff in a clear and interesting way.
Absolutely.
And if you have any thoughts or questions about Land Bank versus Del Rosario, we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below, share this episode with your friends, and subscribe so you never miss a deep dive. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep diving.